both in the House of Delegates and in the State Senate, where he served until he was elected to the House of Representatives. Also with us today, asking a set of, I think, pointed questions after we hear from Congressman Forbes, is Todd Harrison, who is the Senior Fellow for Defense Budget Studies at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Now, you would think that budgets being the source of the funds for all our strategy, that would be a very important issue. But people are less interested in budgets that the budgets are designed to meet. Mr. Harrison has authored a number of publications on trends in the overall defense budget, modernization initiatives, the defense industrial base, military personnel costs, and the costs of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. He frequently contributes to both print and broadcast media, and to give you a sense for his objective reputation, he's on CNN, NPR, Al Jazeera America, and Fox News. So he covers the waterfront. He's been a guest lecturer at a number of the military schools as well. The Army School for Advanced Military Studies, and the National Defense University. He joined CSDA from Booz Allen Hamilton, where he supported clients across the defense industry, and previously worked in the aerospace industry, developing advanced space systems and technologies. He was a captain in the U.S. Air Force Reserve. He is a rocket scientist, graduated from MIT with a BS and an MS in aeronautics and astronautics. And so with that, let me turn it over to Congressman Forbes, who's going to give us his perspective, and then we'll have a conversation with the two of you together. So thank you very much.
Well, Nelson, thank you, and it's delighted to be here with you today, and thanks for CSBA for all the good work they do. Nelson's not very fair to come up here and tell you you're going to have questions poised at you by a rocket scientist from MIT is a little bit disarming, I guess. So, but I have enormous respect, Nelson, for what you do, and Todd for what you do, and I really appreciate this venue, because when you talk about lecture series, they're the most boring things that you can hear, because most of the time, even if the individuals are good, they're not talking about the topics you want to talk about. And so what I'm looking forward to today is to be able to talk about those questions, and in the second and third tier parts of the questions, because anybody normally can respond to the first tier part of that question. So I look forward to that. Secondly, I absolutely know what drives you in here today is the Chick-fil-A. And so anytime you have Chick-fil-A, you're going to have a big turnout. And so what I'd like to do is begin very briefly with kind of an overview of just how I look at some of these topics, and then go right into where Todd and I get to discuss that, Nelson, if it's okay with you. And I start by saying that one of the things that I always tell people as we travel around the country and talk about national defense is, when I come here today, the only benefit really I bring you is I'm a specimen that you can dissect and look at this institution that has a 16% approval rating on a good day and say, at least I can understand kind of what's driving them and what makes them think. And to tell you how I come about some of my thoughts on this issue, it's by listening to a broad array of individuals that we bring in our office, that we go listen, whether it's writers, former secretaries of the Navy, former generals, admirals, individuals who we believe are thinkers on these subjects. And by listening to them almost by osmosis, you begin to pick up things that I think are very, very important. The other thing that's really been a shift is over the last year or so, we've had a huge increase in the number of foreign prime ministers or ambassadors that have wanted to come in and talk about many of these subjects. And it's very interesting to look at the world through their eyes. And let me start by just giving this overview, and then I'm going to sit down and get to the questions. When we talk about national defense, it's almost impossible to talk about national defense without talking about diplomacy. And when I hear people talk about diplomacy, though, oftentimes they only talk about a small part of diplomacy, which is somehow us sitting down having a chit-chat and convincing somebody to do what we want them to do. But to me, diplomacy is so crucial because it has three components, and I don't know how we mitigate the risk around the world without successful diplomacy. And the first part of diplomacy is I think you have to have the right strategy. And when I say that, I just think if you have the wrong strategy, it doesn't really much matter what else you do. But I think you have to have the right strategy. I think secondly, you have to be able to articulate that strategy in a very clear and consistent way so that both your allies and your potential partners, because not all of our partners are allies, and also your competitors or maybe even adversaries, all understand what that strategy is. And then the third thing is you have to have the capacity and capability to give some teeth to your diplomacy. And I've just raised this question to you to open avenues of thought, but also to tell you how I look at this. I think we have not had the right strategy in most parts of the world, and I'll just kind of walk you through a mythical map of the world. But as I look at Europe, for example, and I look at the Russians, the number one thing the Russians wanted us to do was to move our missile defense systems out of Europe, and we gave them that. We put it on the back of the Navy, but we really didn't give the Navy any additional resources to deal with that. And today we have huge gaps in that missile defense system, but that's not the biggest problem. I think we gave a green light to the Russians to say, it's okay, you can do what you want to do in Europe. Now, if you move over to Iran, we all know what the number one thing the Iranians wanted. That was to get the sanctions lifted off them, and we lifted those sanctions. That was their number one thing. We'll see within weeks probably whether that works or not. My suggestion is it won't work. The third thing is, if you look at the Afghan insurgents, the number one thing the Afghan insurgents wanted was a time certain. Let me be able to come to Nelson and say, Nelson, go ahead, be an ally of the United States. But on this date, this time, we're going to come get you and your family. And I can tell you, we hear scores of them that are frightened to death now because we've given that time certain. If you move over to the North Koreans, the big thing the North Koreans wanted was to pull up our landmines along the DMZ. And while this has been kind of a sleeper issue, it's one we've been on top of because it was a huge movement in the administration to sign on to the Ottawa Treaty, even though it would be ratified by the Senate. You would then have executive orders that would say we'd start complying with that. Well, that frightens the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the commander of our forces in South Korea. We had 20,500 troops there, and you have hundreds of thousands of North Koreans, and we've just given them a land bridge to come across and come into that, into South Korea. The final thing is we look at the Chinese, and the biggest thing the Chinese want is to make sure the United States Navy is not increasing, and we have given them that. Now, let me move to the articulation of that policy and just take one aspect of it to make sure I don't take too much time. We see where the president comes out, and I don't disagree with him. In fact, I support him. And he says the big change, the thing we ought to all agree on, is that we're going to have this pivot to the Asia-Pacific area. And then you have the Secretary of Defense backing him up and saying, yes, that's our number one concern. Now, we later have the change in nomenclature to rebalance. I don't take issue with that. That doesn't matter to me really say pivot or rebalance. But then you look at when the president goes on the trip to the Asia-Pacific area, he goes with a backdrop of a budget request for national defense that essentially cuts out a carrier, which is the number one flagship of everything our allies are looking at. We come with a budget that's then basically beaching half of our cruiser fleet, significantly impacting our Tomahawk missile production, and then also sending a message that next year we may be beaching 6 destroyers. Now, if that's not confusing enough for our allies, we just came from a hearing on the OCO request that some of you may have been in, and we have $1 billion in there for reaffirmation of our European initiative. And if you're an ally of ours in the Asia-Pacific area, you have to be scratching your head and saying, wait a minute, you say that the most important thing you have is this pivot to the Asia-Pacific area, and yet we see you reducing the Navy capacity in that area, which is huge. And now we see you bringing this OCO funding, where you say you want $1 billion to reassure your allies in Europe, but you're silent on reassuring your allies in the Asia-Pacific area. And all I'm raising to you today is, one, strategies matter. The way you articulate those strategies matter. But then the third and final part of that is our capacity and capability. And this is one where I'm sure we'll get some good questions about. But let me just kind of open up this door of thinking for you, because I think so goes the answer to this, so goes national defense of this country over the next probably decade. We go back and read a lot of books, some of them new books, some of them old books. We're kind of nerdy, we do that kind of stuff, and I was rereading one of John Lehman's books not too long ago, Command of the Seas, and you know, it struck me about one particular scene that he depicted in there where he's at the War College and the Navy's coming in and they're using a term that just shocked him, which was basically settle. And they were basically saying, based on the budgets and where we are and the changes, we have to begin to settle for what Secretary Lehman would have, I think, termed mediocrity, because that was what was there. And he said the thing that impacted him most was not that the speaker was saying that, but as he looked throughout all of these officers in the Navy, they were nodding their head as if to say, yes, that's what we have to do. And John said it just incensed him because he realized that that was a mindset that was dangerous to the future of this country, and he had to set about trying to change that mindset. I would suggest to you that right now, when it comes to our capacity and capability, the huge debate is going to be whether we should settle based on where we are with current budgets and finances and the projections that we look, or if we have to sit back and say, what is it going to take to defend and protect the United States of America for the next decade or 2 decades? And that's going to be the fundamental question that we have to ask and then answer. So with that, I'm looking forward to sitting down, chatting with Todd, and thank you guys for letting me be here with us.
Thank you again for joining us, Congressman. I wanted to dive right into some of the tough issues here. Hopefully they're not too pointed questions, but we're going to hit some of the really touchy issues I think that are facing defense right now. Thank you so much for doing such a great setup to this part of the discussion by outlining all the strategic challenges the U.S. faces now. I want to turn next to the budget, which is the big fiscal challenge facing DoD. I've got a chart here that just shows how the Budget Control Act budget caps that were put in place going back to 2011. They've changed slightly. Congress has modified them twice since then. And the most recent deal, the Ryan-Murray agreement, raised the budget caps for 2014 and 2015 slightly. It left the caps alone for 2016 and beyond. We've also seen, since 2011, the President's annual budget requests to Congress for DoD have been coming down steadily. They've gotten closer and closer to the level that would be required by the budget caps if they stay in effect. But in the most recent budget request, the President's request stays above the budget caps for 2016 and beyond. So, the Department is still not yet planning those budget caps, and as you speak to members of the military, they'll tell you that they don't think they can go much lower without taking significant risks. So my question for you is, I know you're not happy with these budget caps, but what do you think the prospects are for getting other members of Congress to raise those budget caps for defense for 2016 and beyond?
Well, I think, hope you guys can hear okay in the back. I think anytime we look at trying to predict what Congress is going to do, we get very, very dangerous and murky waters. And so I'll try to do that. I'll say, though, I'm optimistic in this regard. It is the right thing to do to get rid of those caps, especially as it relates to defense. And because of that, I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to do it. I was encouraged by the fact that at least the House came in and said, in its budget, we need to get rid of the caps as it pertains to national defense. I think we've got some good opportunities to have the Senate come along with that, because it is absolutely imperative for us to do it for the national defense of this country. you raised in your preface there, in your statement, a lot of wonderful questions, you know, and perhaps some responses. One of the things, though, is as we look at sequestration, I think we have a fundamental question to ask about national defense of this country. Are we going to have our strategy based on our budget, or our budgets based on our strategy? Now, nobody knows you can do all one way or the other, but you have to ask yourself which one should be driving the other. Certainly, once you have developed a strategy, it is a fair question for the Department of Defense to come over to Congress and say, this is what we need to defend this country. Not one, this is what we need. And here's the risk of the United States of America if we don't do it. But our problem, Todd, is we have been, just like I said, we have to have a clear message to our allies on our strategy and our potential adversaries. We've got to have a clear message to policymakers and to the American people. And what you didn't point out, just because of time, was we started back, we've had basically 5 different reforms in defense since the administration's been in. Unfortunately, all of them have been massive cuts. We had $778 billion of cuts. That's not the figure you ever see, but that's the actual figure that took place before sequestration. Now, this isn't all the president. Congress went willingly into this, but I think both of them were wrong, because it is very hard when we're looking at acquisition programs that are 10, 15 years down the road. And let me take, just for example, the ship construction plan. When you look at the construction plan that the Navy has, and you look at the amount of dollars that we have had average over the last 20 years, that's about a $4 billion shortfall in that plan as we project it out. So how could I say just 2 years ago or 3 years ago, when I was cutting $778 billion, that I was telling everybody, we're good to go, cut out this $778 billion, we're okay with that. And then spin on the dime and try to tell the American people, whoa, wait a minute. Now we have these shortfalls 10 years down the road that are going to come back to haunt us. So I think, Todd, the first question we have to ask is, are we going to have our strategy drive our budget drive strategy? And I think we all agree, the last few years, budget's been driving the strategy. I think that's the wrong direction. Second thing is, Pentagon and Congress has to get on the message of honestly saying, answering these questions. What's the true threat to the United States of America, short term and in the near future? Number 2, what do our combatant commanders need to be able to, need not want, to meet the missions necessary to protect us from this threat? Number 3, how do we get those resources to them in the most efficient means possible? And then the fourth question is 2 components. What can we afford to pay? Fair question. But the second corollary question we haven't been asking, what's the risk to the United States of America if we don't supply those resources? I think if we ask that question, you're going to see policymakers and the American people start saying, we want to defend this country. We don't want these huge gaps in risk.
Thank you. And, you know, leading into the next question, and we're going to get right into one of the third rail issues of the defense budget, military compensation. But, you know, as you look at these budget gaps and how the defense budget has already declined significantly, I like to point out to people it's actually worse, you might think, than the charts might show because of internal cost growth within the defense budget. One of the things that is making it more difficult is the rising cost of personnel. Now, you know, showing this chart that as a percentage of the defense budget during this buildup, military personnel costs remained about 1/3 of the defense budget. But you have to keep in mind, the budget was growing. The number of people did not grow that much, hardly at all over the past decade. The Army and the Marine Corps had people, but the Air Force and Navy were cutting people. Well, now we're actually starting to cut people. And what you see is the cost per service member has grown significantly. And that really is a problem for the Department of Defense. It's those personnel costs. They're either going to consume a larger share of the budget, or we're going to have to keep cutting people. We're already on track to be the smallest active duty force we've had since the end of World War II. So my question to you is, military compensation reform, it's something DOD has proposed time and time again. You know, this year again, the House Armed Services Committee rejected a lot of the things, not everything, that DOD proposed. Is this an issue Congress needs to tackle now, in your view? And if so, what are some general principles we should follow when thinking about military compensation?
Well, I think we're disarming ourselves unilaterally based on a number of different things. One of them is our compensation package. The other one, though, is our healthcare costs. And then the third one is our acquisition costs. And I think you've got to tackle all of those in a programmatic way and in a comprehensive way if we're going to be able to provide the kind of defense we're going to need down the road. I think there are a couple of parameters, though, that you have to look at. I think the first thing on compensation, whether you like it or not, to be successful, you got to grandfather people that are in. You can't go back and look at it with hindsight and say we're going to change the compensation we promised somebody who's already in there. So I think that's one place that you start. Second thing is, I think this is something that's going to have to be done in the Pentagon as a comprehensive program. I think they really need to do it comprehensively. What are we going to do about health care? What are we going to do about the compensation package? And then the third thing, what are we going to do about acquisition reform? And I think that they're going to have to bring that to Congress and show that overall package so they can get a way in from Congress. What you're not going to find is one or two members of Congress that go out with a flag that say, I'm going to lead the charge on compensation reform and follow me over the cliff, because when they get to the cliff, they're going to look back and there's not going to be anybody with them, But I think it's something that the Pentagon needs to be able to address and then come to members of Congress, and we've got to do a buy-in to try to look at the program that's going to do that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's all bad time. I mean, one of the things that you look at this, there are some compensation reform things that can be done that really help better meet the needs of some of the men and women who are going to be coming in the military in the future. They don't all have the same kinds of wants or concerns that people might have had 20 years ago. So I think that's the kind of discussion that we're going to have.
Okay, then that's interesting. You're tying it in with acquisition reform is a good way to get it through. The next third rail issue we'll hit on is BRAC. That's something that DOD has requested for several years now. It's in this budget request again. It looks like it's dead on arrival for this year. I think some of the real legitimate resistance in Congress is due in part to the last BRAC. The 2005 BRAC cost far more than anticipated. It actually cost more than all previous rounds of BRAC combined. And the savings were much slower to accumulate than originally forecasted. So my question for you is there any way DOD is going to get another BRAC in Congress right now? Or do we need to start looking at a different way of downsizing facilities and bases?
Well, I think the operative phrase there is right now. And I would say I would be shocked if they're successful in getting a round of BRAC through right now. But I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is the overall instability of the economy across the country. I think the last BRAC, where it's easy to point to the fact and say you didn't peg very many things right on the last BRAC. I think the third thing is Pentagon doesn't even know what they want out of a BRAC right now. They couldn't come in and give you the requirements, and the devil's always in the detail. But I do think, in fairness, there is a broader picture. You've written some good stuff about this. Some people in this room have written some good things about this and talked about fair arguments that you can put down about BRAC and perhaps the efficiency of having another round of BRAC. But let me tell you what I think the essence of it is. It's two parts. One of them is the thing that all of you all can hear and absolutely agree on, the parochialism. People just say, I don't want to cut my base, and I have a fair question and guilty for a lot of members of Congress. But there's a bigger question. And the bigger question is this. If you believe the force structure that we are moving towards is the right force structure, then you need to support BRAC. If you believe, as I do, that force structure is not the right force structure, and that force structure could be dangerously low, you need to fight like the Dickens to stop a BRAC. Because once you have had those BRACs and locked into that force structure, it's going to be almost economically impossible to recreate that and build it back again. So, Todd, I think there will be two levels of discussion going on here. One is just the normal parochial thing that you walk in the door and have in your pocket. Fair thing. But the second one, for all of us who care about these issues, it's a fair debate of whether or not we are taking these force structures in the right areas. Because I will tell you, once we have that BRAC locked in, it is incredibly costly and difficult to rebuild them. And one of the interesting things, as I mentioned at the beginning, I bring in a lot of people in my office and listen to some of you in this room, and I do just listen. I listen to what they say. Almost to the person, when they talk about, for example, the Navy, they'll talk about just keep them alive. Keep these ships alive, give us a chance to rebuild them. don't let them destroy them, because we'll never be able to build them back again. I always think about that scene in The Last of the Mohicans, where the guy's under the waterfall, and he said, just stay alive, I'll find you. Well, I think to some of us who believe we need to build these force structures back, BRAC is very, very concerning as we start pouring in concrete the reduction of those force structures.
Great. The next question is more politically sensitive within DoD. As the service shares of the budget, people like to talk about how the services had relatively constant, almost immovable shares of the budget, as if they're set in stone, a third. Of course, that's actually not the case if you look back in history. We've seen the services shares of the budget fluctuate quite a bit. As shown in this graph, the Air Force at one point was getting about half of the DoD total budget back in the 50s. And it also, of course, neglects the fact that defense-wide accounts that aren't in any of the services have grown to almost 20% of the budget. So my question for you is, do you think the services shares of the budget are about right, where they are right now, or is this something that needs to be revisited as strategy and threats change?
I think that we should not have a preconceived notion that we are going to have this equal distribution, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, even though you're exactly right. It hasn't always been like that. It's not an exact thing. But we all know there's a lot of politics that walks into the Pentagon saying, okay, we don't want to fight among the services, so let's basically try to keep these areas equal. I think it should all be on the table for discussion. And what we ought to be able to at least ask is, what are the priorities that we see for the future for our national defense? And if in that priority you see that you're going to have to shift more dollars to the Air Force or to the Army or to the Navy, I think that's a fair discussion that you should be having at the Pentagon and we should be having in Congress. So I have always advocated getting away from that preconceived notion that everything just needs to be 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. And let me give you a perfect example of that. If you were to ask that question and conclude that the answer was, we need to have a certain number of ships in our Navy over the next decade or 20 years, and I'm not prejudging that, although I feel that we need to do that, but you could ask and answer that question anything you want. You're only talking about 1.2 to like 1.5% shift in the budget, and you could build those ships. Now, what I'm saying, Todd, is you at least need to be asking the question about priorities and put that on the table. When you get to some things like the Ohio class and other things like that, you're going to find we just can't do without those things. And so it may require some shifting of those budgetary allocations that I think we need to be willing to do.
So you're basically saying we should let our strategy drive the service shares of the budget.
I've always said I think our strategy should drive our budget and our strategy should drive the shares that we have.
Right. So my last question before we open it up for questions from the audience, and this is right in your sweet spot as chairman of the Sea Power Subcommittee on the HASC. What do you think the top acquisition priorities for the Navy ought to be, given the threats we're likely to face in the next 10 to 20 years? And in particular, I want to ask you about, how should the fleet and the carrier air wing evolve in light of those threats?
If I were to say the overall goal of where I think the Navy should be, it ought to be building ships. And I think that seems pretty simple, but we faced that in our markup this year. And I listened to everyone. I listened to the Pentagon. I tried to give an open hearing. Everybody come in and said, well, this is why we ought to cut this out. This is why we ought to cut this out. Finally, about 8 o'clock, I literally pounded on the desk and said, no, we're going to build ships. I said, every Navy major power we look at in the world, they're increasing their Navy. We're one of the few that's decreasing ours. We had a hearing the other day that some wonderful people, and I won't mention their names if you weren't hearing, but I mean, very talented people from the wonderful, good people. These are brilliant people, all of us smarter than me. But here's the thing that baffles you. They can walk in from the Pentagon today and say, this is the number of ships we need in 2024 with the exact number. But they could not answer the question, how many ships do we need today? And that's a little bit startling. We ought to be able to say, fairly, these are the ships we need for the United States Navy. And let me tell you why that's crucial. I firmly believe, not being parochial, not just because it's my subject, the last decade was the decade of the Army and the Marine Corps. We asked a disproportionate sacrifice to them. They stepped up to the plate, they did. But almost every analyst I talked to, not just in the United States, around the globe. I believe the next 10, 20 years will be the decade of the Navy. So goes the Navy, so goes the defense of the United States of America. If that's true, Todd, and a lot of people feel it's true, we need to be saying as our top question, what are the number of ships we need, and how are we going to create and build and sustain those ships? The question you have about the air lane of our carriers, we know with the A2, A3 defenses, they are pushing our carriers further and further back. I'm a firm believer that we're going to have an integrated carrier air lane. And I think a big part of that's going to be the U-class. That's going to be a part of that, along with a mix of our planes. They don't all need to be the same kind of planes. They can't be the same kind of planes because they've got different kind of missions that they're going to be able to do. But that's why I think the direction we go with U-class is so vitally important, because I think it will determine the relevance of aircraft carriers 10, 20, well, actually 20 years down the road. But it's also going to determine the effectiveness of us penetrating those A2, AD defenses. And so that's why I think we're going to have that mix of an air lane that will be a little different than what we see today.
Well, just to quickly follow up on that with the U class, I know you're going into a hearing after this, but that's going to be one of the items discussed. But if you could just give us your views. Is the Navy getting it right on U class requirements, or what do you think?
Well, the two things we need to always recognize here. When a lot of times I talk about China in places, and people think China has a black hat or have a white hat. And the first thing I will say is, when you say China, what aspect are you talking about China? Because it's a multifaceted country with a lot of different moving parts. When you say the Navy, we walk in here like the Navy is like monolithic, and they walk in with one hat and say, I'm the United States Navy, and everybody here agreed on this, and I'll come back with the unanimous decision. There's always been a battle within the Navy. I mean, when we went from sail to steam, there was a huge battle. We shouldn't do that. Aircraft carriers, if we'd have listened to the Pentagon, they would have been surveillance platforms that would have been out there. Even some of our nuclear programs, Tomahawk missiles. So every once in a while, Congress stumbles on an acorn, and they get it right. But the biggest thing we can do is continue to ask the questions, so we're measuring twice and cutting once. And I think it's a fair question. When you look at a U-class that's going to deploy 10 plus years from now, then the question you have to ask is, do we want a platform that will really be a high-class surveillance platform doing pretty much what we can already do today, and perhaps not even capable of penetrating some of the defenses that we have to do? Or should it be an integrated part of that carrier wing that can really have a different capacity for a decade from now? And what I would say is, I fall in the latter, but I'm quickly say that I'm not the smartest person in this country on these issues, and I recognize that. But I think the important thing for us to do is to ask that question. And so what we try to do is to say to the Navy, because there's a struggle within the Navy now of which direction to go with that, and we say, instead of locking into this for a decade, maybe we ought to take a few months and let the Secretary of Defense just make sure we've got these requirements right before we do it. I think if I'm right, we may have saved the program for a decade or 2 decades. And if I'm wrong, then most people lost us a few months. I think it's worth that risk.
I love your carpentry metaphor, measure twice, cut once, and that's especially important given the strategic challenges we face and fiscal challenges we face. We won't get another chance.
That's right. This is locked in this.
Yeah. So with that, I want to open it up for questions from the audience. Okay.
Sure. George Michelson, a consultant for U.S. Special Operations Command. We've been talking in terms of the defense budget. About 2 years ago, Sam Nunn chaired a 3-day session over at CSIS, dealing with national security and the national debt. He had Alan Simpson, Erskine Bowles there. He had Alice Whitlow, Senator Domenici with 2 commissions. He had Admiral Mullen there, who retired. He had Secretary Gates. He had Secretary Baker, who was Secretary of Treasury under Ronald Reagan. He had Rubin, the Secretary of Treasury. And he had 10 former congressmen and senators from both parties, both sides of the aisle. And basically, they came up at the end with a consensus that said, it's just not the defense budget. There are 3 things we're going to have to solve. And they had all the kinds of charts that Todd has. It said, we've got to solve the revenue issue. We've got to solve the tax code. And we've got to solve entitlements, not just DOD entitlements. And then the question came up, and he said, the problem is the way the Congress is set up right now, you're not going to get advocacy or get either one of the three passed, you're almost going to have to bundle all three together and treat it almost like a bracket. So a congressman who's opposed the revenue issue can go back to his district and not, but I got changes in the tax cut. Do you see any potential in the future of addressing all three of those issues?
I see potential of addressing all three, but I don't see it in some grand bargain that takes place. And here's what happens. I think it's dangerous for us to walk in here and, you know, the last several years, maybe 10 years, the buzz phrase has been comprehensive. We want to do everything comprehensive, you know. And comprehensive sometimes is just a buzz phrase for not doing anything, you know, because, I mean, if I came in here and tried to do all of this, it's so overwhelming, I couldn't even begin to do it. And I think that's what happens when Congress comes and says, okay, the whole country's in a mess right now, so how do we do all of this? Revenue, how do we deal with, you know, all of the tax code, how do we do with our budgeting cycle? And I don't think we're successful in that. I don't think we know how to do that very well. And the danger of doing it is if we get it wrong, we've put all our eggs in one basket. That's why I think you have to come back and talk about all those issues. But the way we solve it is incremental. Now, the only way I can do it is put the helmet on that I normally use in the game to play with, which is defense. And so I think it's a fair question for me to say, look, you guys can't solve everything in this basket. At least listen to me on defense. One, if we get that wrong, none of the rest of the stuff you're talking about matters anyway. So we better get this right. Number two, I had an ambassador in my office a few years ago, actually a few months ago, and he's looking at me and we're talking about some things we wanted to do in this country in national defense, and he looks at me and says, you know, Congressman, a few years ago, we made huge cuts in national defense, and the world didn't come to an end. And I literally put my hand on his shoulder, and I said, Mr. Ambassador, you're exactly right. But I said, if you'd guessed wrong, if you'd misjudged, who would your backstop be? And he pointed and said, you. I said, we have no backstop. We're the backstop of freedom for the world. That's why we can't, I mean, if I mess up the transportation bill, it's a bad thing, but it's not the end of the world. If I mess up national defense, it could be the end of the world. The third thing, though, is I come back, and I'm not a Monday morning quarterback. I did this when it happened. Let's take the stimulus bill that was passed. It was $825 billion, give or take a billion. And the interest on it was $347 billion. The day that was passed, I put up a chart, and I said, this is going to come right out of national defense. I mean, overlay. And if you take the overlay national defense, it's almost an exact impact of that bill. And my question to you or anybody else in the room is this. Where do you think you'd got more economic impact if you wanted to help the national debt or anything else for the country? Putting those dollars in national defense or putting them in that stimulus package? And I think most people say national defense. And so, well, George, I absolutely agree with you. We've got to deal with all those issues. I don't think we'll be successful in getting them all under one group. And we can't say just because I can't deal with all of them, I can't deal with this one because this one is staring us in the eye right now. And decisions we're making today, as you know, will be locked in protected.
Other questions? Yes.
Edward Clyde, McCain Institute. You first mentioned strategy, and I was a welcome to talk about strategy rather than budget. But one emerging right now is the annexation of the South China Sea by the Chinese. And it appears to me that while all the parties belong to the UN Convention, the Chinese are saying, we're not going to play by those rules. And the U.S. doesn't seem to have a strategy about it. Am I right or wrong?
Well, first of all, I read your recent piece on acquisition reform with John, and I thought that was well done on doing that. Secondly, I think if I take all those folks that I'm telling you about to come in my office, prime ministers, ambassadors, if I ask them the question each of us, what's our strategy? None of them can answer that question. And so I would tell you this, if we have a strategy, it is kept so secret and buried in some room somewhere that I don't have access to it. And if I don't have access to it, then our allies don't have access to it. And if they don't have access to it, it doesn't do us much good. So I think the important thing is we have to not only have a strategy, but we have to be able to articulate that strategy. And we've got to do it in a consistent manner. And the importance of that is our allies right now really want to come alongside of us. They want to make acquisition decisions that are complementary to what we're doing. and in line with us. It's very difficult for them to do that if they don't know what that strategy is. But here's the bigger thing. If we're not very clear on that strategy, we run the risk that the Chinese overestimate their ability and underestimate our willingness. And that could be a very, very devastating situation to occur. That's why I think it's important we not only have that strategy, but we start implementing that strategy. And the last thing I'll tell you is part of that strategy is not just something on a piece of paper. Strategy is something that starts to get implemented by your acquisition decisions as well. And I think one of the clearest things we could have had for a strategy could have been me is I'd have been having that carrier front and center that was up there. I'd be saying we're going to build these ships. That's sending a huge message to the whole Asia Pacific area that we're there. And I'll tell you, I'm not one for adding more dollars in here, but if I'm going to put $1 billion in to reassure the Europeans, I'd sure by gosh put $1 billion in to reassure our Asian allies that we're going to be there with you in some of these situations. I think that would have been a huge and important thing for us to do.
Other questions?
Sure. Byron County Capital Outlet Partners. You talked about the acquisition for one of the issues that Todd raised and entitlements and other things, big picture things to be big picture. What would you like to see out of acquisition for? What do you think is a low-hanging fruit there? What needs to be addressed?
I think there's some, first of all, acquisition reform is very, very tricky. I mean, you know that, everybody in this room knows it. And we've talked about theory, but then implementing it is tough. But let me just kind of go up on the high level as you talked about, a low-hanging fruit. I think the number one thing we ought to recognize is we've got to get rid of some of these layers of approvals that have to be taken place. As you guys know, in some of these platforms, we're talking about 40 different approvals that have to take place before we get something deployed. And the big key is not just money, it's the time. I mean, we can literally have 22 years. Well, when you're comparing that with the Chinese and the Iranians, who are averaging maybe 6.5 to 9.5 years on the approach, the math doesn't work out very good for us at some point in time. So the first thing I would do tomorrow is I'm going to give me a list of all those approval platforms that I have to do, and I try to slice them in half. That would make an enormous difference. The next thing I've got to do is this. I'm not a big supporter of earmarking just small and medium-sized businesses, or this company has to do this, or this company has to. What I think we need to have is level playing fields for everybody, so we get the best products at the best prices. And let me give you a perfect example of that. It works both ways. First of all, a lot of our companies are coming in now and say they're going to have to get out of some of these areas because everything is being pulled for a small or medium-sized business, and because of the way they define it, they're no longer a small or medium-sized business, even though they think they are. That's one thing we ought to at least be looking at, putting on the table. We don't want to lose companies out there. But the second part of that is we have a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that can get an idea to deployment quicker than a large company can. And yet, a lot of our generals and admirals aren't able to do that because of the bureaucratic red tape they have to go through. And a lot of these small and medium-sized companies are saying, we don't mind investing our dollars, but we want to make sure our intellectual property is protected once we do that, so it's worth our investment. I think there are 3 steps we could take literally tomorrow that would make a huge difference in our acquisition process.
So in the back there, sir.
I'm Dennis Halpin from the U.S. Career Institute at SICE. Following up on, the administration does say they have a strategy for Asia called the Asia Pivot or the Rebalance to Asia, but I talked to a lot of our friends in the region, and a lot of people see this as a lot of hot air. I mean, a few thousand Marines in Darwin, Australia, maybe symbolically have some meaning, but with China's on the books and off the books, defense budget increases with their missile development, their building of the Blue Water Naval. Where in our budget now, our defense budget, is the strategy of the pivot to Asia reflected? Is there actually money being put into this?
There are some dollars in this, but, and Dennis, could you stand up? I can't see you when you sit down. Let me just say, there are some dollars in there, but the strategy is not reflected, I don't think, in that budget very well. And I think that is really a weakness when you look at that strategy and you saw the initial picture. I think our allies were excited to hear that. They wanted to see that. But then they have been looking for the teeth to kind of come in that, and I think they haven't seen it. Let me just tell you a couple of things that really worry me. If you look at the CNO right now, who I have enormous respect for, a wonderful man, did a great job. But many of you remember the comment he had just a few weeks ago with, I think Mr. Warpile, I might be wrong on that, where he said in response to a question that to even talk about publicly competitiveness with China was over the line and we shouldn't be doing it. I mean, can you imagine the message that sends out to folks in the Asia-Pacific area, and especially to the Chinese, when we're talking about, remember what you were saying about them and some of their aggressive movements, when you say, we're so concerned about you that we're going to give you a veto power of what we even talk about. How in the world would they think if we ever put any teeth in to trying to stop them from doing something? So I think that's a big concern. But I think secondly, one of the things we used to do very well was cost imposition strategies, where we literally thought and looked at individual countries that could be competitors of ours, not adversaries, but even competitors. And we said, okay, how can we compete? Well, nobody wants to try to manage China. We can't do that, but we have to recognize their defense dollars are increasing dramatically, and they're all pointed at us. One of the things we ought to at least be doing is what we used to do pretty well, which is to say, okay, how can we increase their cost? One of the best ways we can increase their cost without having to increase ours a lot is to get better relationships with our allies in terms of our acquisition policies, because it makes them spend a lot of dollars other places instead of fixating on us. There are the kinds of things that I'm just not seeing happening now that I think we should be doing.
I'm picking on a related question in terms of showing our rebalance to the Pacific more clearly. One of the ideas that's been floated is perhaps forward-facing another carrier in the Pacific region. We have one in Japan now, but the idea of basing a carrier perhaps out of Hawaii or Guam, or even a second carrier out of Japan if they would agree. The problem, of course, is that carrier has to come from somewhere. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that would be a good move for the department?
I think there's a couple of things. I think that's something that should be on the table for discussion. But remember, it's not just forward-facing. It's how many carriers we've got to do that. I mean, if we had taken this, I think somebody mentioned it, but if they didn't, I'll tell you, we've got a gap in coverage of what we're going to have for carriers out there right now. I mean, we can't need all the coverage that we need. So whether they're forward deployed or not, the first question we have is how many carriers we've got to have. And you start at least having the discussion where administrations come in and say we're going to drop a carrier out. I mean, that increases that gap enormously wherever it's based. But the second thing that you've got to look at is we've just added about 2 months more deployment on the sailors that are on those carriers out there. So I think that's one question. And then the second thing is we wish we could say to the rest of the world, would you guys calm down so we don't have to put our carriers over here and we can put them. That hasn't happened to us yet. And so right now, I think way before we get to forward-facing, we need to say how many carriers do we need to have to make sure we've got those carriers there so that we can cover the places we need. I don't think you have to go to the basing question to be able to do that coverage question.
So.
Congressman James Illingworth, I work from the British Embassy. In light of the fact that there are events changing the global context right now, and your comment about concentrating and investing in the here and now, should there be a fundamental change in strategic thinking in the US on the basis of Libya, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Ukraine, and that North European CENTCOM focus that exists now and is likely to exist for certainly the next couple of years, and maybe
the volatility of the world right now is, I think, surpassing what any of us would have expected 10 years ago. And that's something we can't control. We've never been able to, we were not going to be able to control it. I think your question is a valid question. I think it has really two answers that seem mutually exclusive, and I don't think they are. I think, first of all, we have to have a strategy, and we have to be able to articulate that strategy and communicate it well, and I don't think we've done a very good job of it. The second thing is we cannot write that strategy and then leave that strategy and think it will take care of us forever. We have to constantly be relooking that and re-examining that because the world is changing dramatically and very rapidly in the state that we're in. And I think what yesterday's battles are not necessarily going to be fought the same way tomorrow's battles are fought. And that's always a very difficult thing for us to do, but I think it's something that's necessary for us to do. And the other thing that I think we've got to do a better job of how we articulate that strategy, Todd kind of alluded to that a little bit. Remember, we're not just talking about battles that are being fought. We're talking about asymmetric things that can take place. And when I'm in New York, for example, I get to talk to some of my friends over there. One of the questions, they always ask is, why does defense matter to me? Well, 95% of all the international financial transactions that take place every day is underwater cable. It's not satellite. Well, just like we see some of these hot spots that you're talking about around the globe, we're seeing more tax on those cables that we've got to protect. 85% of all the goods that we're seeing sold around the world are going on the surface of the oceans. We got to be looking at that. And then we recognize what in the world happens if you have a 2-week delay in oil shipments anywhere around the world. So all of that has to be a part of our strategy too, that's constantly being re-examined and looked at.
Congressman, final question with C-Power and Simplified, a couple other magazines. You talk about capacity and capability to execute the strategy. Capacity is the number of systems we have. Capability, a lot of times, depends on readiness. The Pentagon and the services are complaining that what you folks are doing with the budget right now, you're maintaining capacity, which cuts into their ability to spend on readiness, which reduces their short-term capability.
That's a fair question, and I think a fair criticism for them. The problem I would say to them is, again, what I've raised, I wish you guys were here 4 or 5 years ago when you were cutting that $778 million and we were pleading with you to talk about how it's going to impact that capacity and capability. And you also know, and we've had testimony from several of our PACCOM folks that say at some point in time capacity equals capability. And so while what we are saying is we think that we can add that capability if we have to build it up, but if we lose that capacity, it's going to be very difficult for us to recover that. That kind of goes back to my statement about keeping them alive. If we can keep them alive, hopefully we can turn this debate around and we can get that ability to have that capability and the capacity, which I think we need both.
Another trade-off, piece off of that is the long-term capability, right? And the near-term capacity or long-term capability. One of the areas of long-term capability the Navy is struggling right now with is the Ohio-class subs that are going to reach the end of their life. It's already been extended to 42 years. And they've got the Ohio-class replacement program already in the works. But, as you're well aware, it doesn't look like there's going to be room in the shipbuilding budget.
Well, there wouldn't be room in the shipbuilding budget for that. I mean, it would suck everything pretty much out of it. That's why this year we began down this road of having a separate funding account. I've always advocated that. I think the Ohio class is a national importance. I think it should be funded with a different line item than the shipbuilding account, and I think ultimately we'll see that happen. I mean, that's just too important of a national strategic program for us to let it suck everything out of the shipbuilding program. The important part of that is, as all of you know, is even though that's a decade or so down the road, if we wait, then we're never going to be able to fund. That's why we have to begin starting that right now and how we handle it.
So that would effectively mean a shift in budget shift.
Absolutely. Right. But look, we're out front. We need to do that. It's important to do that. We talked about that this year. We had a program to begin to start that debate this year in our markup. I think that's going to be vitally important for us, and it's vitally important for the national security of this country. I mean, you can't get rid of those Ohio classes. It's going to have to be there, and the only way we're going to do it is with a separate funding stream.
Okay, question?
How's it going, sir? Rick Sora, MLA Policy Administrator. But my question is, maintaining a strong defense has sort of fallen victim to, I would call, petty political division that Congress is seeing, where the conservatives are advocating for it and the liberals are dismissing it. And this is so much bigger than that. So what steps can we begin to take to start making this more so a bipartisan issue, and start making this more of something that unites this nation?
Well, that's an age-old question, but I'll tell you the first step we take are what you guys are doing here now. I mean, you could have been a lot of places today for lunch. You were here asking these questions. I can't tell you how many times when I get somebody come to my office, they ask me a real tough question. They're almost apologizing for it, and I thank them for asking the question. Listen, you don't know how many places I go, and nobody cares about, those issues until we have a crisis, and it's too late. So I think the first thing we have to do is boldly ask these questions and put them on the table. And then the second thing we've got to do is be able to talk to the American people. Forget just talking to people, policymakers, because they're going to respond to what the American people do. We've got to be able to paint pictures better. When you go to the American people talking about reset and all those terms, it just goes over their head, and, it means nothing to them. But when you start painting a picture, I mean, for example, when you tell them that in 8 years the Chinese will have 82 subs in the Pacific area, we'll have 32. All of a sudden, I don't care if they're Republican, Democrat, liberal, or conservative, they start paying attention to that. Second thing is, talk about reset, that don't mean anything. Talk about budget dollars, it doesn't mean anything to them. But when you ask them this, would you say, would you put your son or daughter on an airplane to fly into LA today if when you walked up those stairs, there was a plaque on the side of the plane that says, warning, the pilots of this plane have only had 70% of their training, and we've only done 70% of the maintenance on this aircraft. You'd pull them off so quick that you wouldn't know what to do, and yet that's what they're asking us to do, the men and women in the Navy and other places around the globe. When they start seeing that picture, and we start painting that better, I think then the American people get concerned, and that makes policymakers get concerned, Republican or Democrat. And let me give you a statistic that'll back it up. When sequestration first came out, I was against it, fought against it, spoke about it, just lost. And then I said, we need to go around the country and talk about that issue. Most of my leadership was saying, nobody cares. It's only polling 6 or 7%. And I said, the reason nobody cares is because they don't know about it. I said, if we go about and start raising the issue, people will care. At the end of that debate with everybody here, 67% of the American people said, we don't want to make less than national. So I think that's the approach we have to take. Paint those pictures, take it to the American people. I think they'll start saying to the policymakers, Republican or Democrats, we want you to fix this problem.
As you close, I know we're getting close on time here. One final question, it's an easy one. Your best guess, do you think we get a defense appropriations bill passed on time this year?
One time, no. But that's an easy question. Do we get one? Every year we wrestle with that. And every year the same stats come to play. We're not going to get it in July, that. And then, I don't know, Eric, we're computing these days. We'll be back, and I was shocked that you guys know this. We're only in session, like 6, 7, 8 days or something like that. September, not a big window. And I really don't see the Senate doing much before the election. And then my worry is this: after the election, either way it goes, they may say, let's punt it till next year. But we have the same fears every year. And so I'm optimistic that we will get something out, whether it's this omnibus bill or whether it's a defense bill by the end of the year. But it always keeps my stomach in knots, too, because everybody else. Well, guys, thank you so much for letting me be here with you today. Todd, thank you.
Thank you.